Wow, we got everyone in the room. Amazing. Woo! Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am Faye Rosenfeld, and I am the Vice President of Public Programs here at the New York Public Library. I am delighted to welcome all of you to tonight's conversation with Rebecca Traister and Aminatou Sow, celebrating the publication of Rebecca's new book, Good and Mad: The Revolutionary Power of Women's Anger. Tonight's event, like all our public programs, is an extension of the library's mission, which is to serve as a welcoming, open, democratic space in New York for all New Yorkers, a place where people can gather to read, learn about, and discuss the issues that matter to them, their communities, the country, and the world. We are honored that Rebecca Traister has come to the library this evening to talk about an issue that could not be more important or compelling or timely: the power of women's anger as a galvanizing force for social change. This is a subject that she writes about with singular clarity, and I have to say, I simply could not put her book down. We are also really thrilled to have Aminatou Sow with us, joining Rebecca in conversation this evening. Aminatou fans. Aminatou is, among many things, the co-host with Ann Friedman of the truly fabulous podcast, which I think many of us listen to, Call Your Girlfriend. And so, Aminatou, thank you for being here, and thank you for giving us hours and hours of listening pleasure. Their conversation will last around 45 minutes. After that, we will open the floor for some audience Q&A. And so if you have brief questions at the end, you'll be able to make your way to the center aisle. We will have a standing mic right there. Afterwards, Rebecca will be signing copies of her book. So if you haven't done that already, please be sure to pick up a copy from the library shop concession right over there. And all sale proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. In just a second, I will ask Rebecca and Aminatou to come to the stage. But before doing that, I want to make 3 quick plugs for the library. First, I want to plug this little thing, the library card. This card is your key to unlocking the tens of millions of items that are waiting for you to explore in our collections. It is a small but powerful tool in the toolkit of democracy. You can use it to do things like check out books, of course, but also you can read The New Yorker online, or you can download an ebook to your phone, or you can watch a movie, or you can sign up for Culture Pass, which gives you free access to dozens of museums around the city, and there's so much more. So I just need to do this. We do this at all our programs. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you have a library card? That's really amazing. Wow. Okay, so maybe I don't need to say the next line, but I'm going to say it anyway. If you don't have one, or if you haven't used it in a while, at the end of the program, after you've bought Rebecca's book and had her sign it, you can make a right turn at the end of the hall and head into our Mid-Manhattan branch, which is in this building right now temporarily, and meet our wonderful librarians. They are here until 9 o'clock. They've curated a wonderful display of books for this evening. So go in there, meet them, apply for a card if you don't have one, talk to them, check out a book if you feel like it. And so please do that. My second plug is simply that you come back. Your program lists some upcoming events, such as Laurie Anderson and the Icelandic poet Jean, who are here tomorrow night, or the wonderful novelist Sarah Perry, who will be here on October 17th to talk about her new book, Melmoth, which The Guardian just today called one of the great literary achievements of the century. We have 2 exhibitions opening this month featuring the work of female photographers, and there's just a huge amount going on. So I hope you follow us on social media at NYPL events. I hope you're signed up for our newsletters. And let me mention the hashtag for this evening's program is, of course, Good and Mad. Last plug, I promise. This program, tonight's program, and others like it are made possible by the generosity of the New York Public Library supporters. So I would really like to ask you to help us continue to serve all the people who turn to us for free access to books, classes, community events, and more. It's really simple. To make a $10 donation to the New York Public Library, all you have to do is take out your phone and text the word library. That's LIBRARY to 501501. Your contribution, which will be on your phone bill, will help us get the additional books and resources that we need. Again, text library to 501-501 to show your support. And please note, they want me to say, please note, messaging and data rates may apply. Okay, that's it for my plugs. I really want to thank you all for being here and ask you to please join me in welcoming Rebecca Traister and Aminatou Sow.
So many rowdy people in this library. My God. Rebecca, they're all here to see you. I'm so happy that we're here. I remember when you told a couple of us that you were writing this book. It felt right at the moment. I can't believe that you engineered it to happen.
Right?
With
the
this
marketing
news cycle.
schedule was really, it was tremendous what Simon & Schuster did to this country.
Yeah, the resistance meetings all coming through. You pointed out on Twitter that, historically the first week of October is really busy. The Times broke the Weinstein story a year ago. 2 years ago, the Access Hollywood tape was released. 27 years ago, Anita Hill announced that she was willing to testify. And 229 years ago, women rioted in Paris.
They did.
And the thing that is so wonderful about Good and Mad is just how clear you are about the historical through line, about women's anger and how catalytic and powerful it is. And I was wondering if you could speak to that. What is the catalyst?
Well, it's actually, first of all, thank you all for coming. And thank you for doing this. So the historical through line is the thing that all of a sudden came into focus for me. There was this moment. I've been writing, I'm a feminist journalist. I've been a feminist journalist for 15 years at this point, or something like it. And if you write about gender inequality, racial inequality, economic inequality, if you write about politics in this country, your work is probably grounded in some way in anger. Mine certainly always has been. But I also, at various points, have taken pains to disguise that, obscure it, pretty it up, make it a lot more palatable for readers, because like so many women in this country, I have absorbed the reality that if you express yourself with unapologetic anger, there's a chance that that's going to work against you, that you're not going to be heard, that you're going to be heard as over-emotional, as hysterical, as infantile, as performative and theatrical, as unhinged, right? And so I had taken pains to cover it up, but obviously I felt it and it informed my work, but I'd never really thought of anger as a lens for my work. And then in this sort of in-between the election of 2016 and the inauguration of Donald Trump, I was feeling really conflicted and cloudy in my brain. I couldn't figure out what my work and my responsibility and my job was. And I said to my husband, I'm just too angry to think straight. And he suggested that I should think about writing about anger. And as soon as he made that suggestion, it's like everything, it was like, chunk, 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 chunk. It all came into focus. It was just this incredibly clarifying moment, and I realized I'd never really permitted myself, or maybe it just had never occurred to me to think of anger as this through line, but as soon as I thought about what I was feeling and what I was anxious to express, I was like, right, I want to write about anger. I want to write not just my own, this book is not about my anger, but about the role that women's anger is playing, the ways it's suppressed and repressed, the anger between women that can be corrosive to coalition. I want to write about, and that all suddenly was like, right, there's going to need to be a chapter about that, and there's going to need to be a chapter about women's anger in service of a white capitalist patriarchy on the right, and there's going to, Phyllis Schlafly needs some time here, and then it's the history, and it's like, right, I got to write about everything, and it's stuff that I had written about in my second book, All the Single Ladies, where I'd taken sort of a lot of years and done a lot of research about history that I hadn't ever been taught. And I was like, right, oh my God, the anger is right there in all that history too, and I'd never thought of it there either. And so that's where it really was this sort of moment of, like, really sudden moment of clarity that, like, oh my God, there's a story here. There is a through line. And all these social movements, which I'd known in abstract because I had actually had to go and learn about them, from the labor movement, you know, abolition and suffrage, the temperance movement, the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, and the women's movement of the 1970s. And I'd read a lot about them in recent years, and I was like, but I never thought, but the anger was right there, but we never talk about it.
I mean, that's something that was so apparent to me reading it. You have these really powerful scenes through various movements that we have, and women's anger and really women's fury is at the center of that. And we never learn about it at school. It's quelled. We found a way to sanitize every expression of anger that women have. Like, I think particularly about Rosa Parks that you write about in your book, and how that story is taught in schools as some very tired black lady.
Tired.
She was so tired. She was so tired.
The key thing to know about Rosa Parks is that she was tired.
She was tired, and thanks to her tiredness, things happen for us.
Thank God that she was both tired and stoic. I don't know if you've also heard she was stoic and she was a seamstress. So just in case you needed your truly furious revolutionary remade into an easily digestible female figure, that was what happened to Rosa Parks.
I mean, the book in this way is a love letter to the women who came before us. Like, you talk about, you've glossed over this a little bit, but the women in the labor movement. I've always thought of labor as this very, male-dominated Teamsters. Thank God
like
for the
coal
male
miners.
Teamsters and
coal
the coal
miners,
miners.
Yeah.
And you write about these young women who actually were furious. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah, so I do also, there are a couple strains of unionism. There are the teachers' unions, which are obviously, and that's a political force, and that is a force that is, we think of as feminized because teaching has been historically a profession that was designed for women. But aside from teacher unionism, I think of labor history in this country as being a story of white men's movement toward greater economic equality and opportunity. But in fact, some of the first iterations of the labor movement in this country happened in Lowell, Massachusetts in the 1830s. And it was the young women working in the Lowell textile mills. And they actually borrowed language, like so many of the angry women who I write about in this book, because the kind of anger that we do respect in this country is the anger of the founders, right? The give me liberty or give me death, live free or die. The white male anger of political insurrection is seen as righteous and patriotic. It is our catechism, our national lullaby. And we recognize that anger as key to our very identity. And so many of the angry women who I found as I went back and sort of searched for the women at the beginning of these movements, and then when I found the women, were like, okay, were they tired or were they angry? So the Lowell girls used the language that they formed one of the first labor unions in the country in the 1830s. They also formed, because a lot of this is about how there is an interconnectedness between these fights, they also formed one of the first women's abolition societies in the country. But in their unionizing, they borrowed language as our forefathers resisted the avarice of the British king, so we challenge the avarice, what's created these bad working conditions for us. But I was never taught about the Lowell Mill girls. I read them when I read.
I learned everything I knew about women's history in your book. To be clear.
I just want to assure all the actual historians here that she really did not just learn it all. A lot. And also, I'm so sorry for everything I may have gotten wrong. I'm acutely aware of the fact that I am not a scholar. I'm not an academic. I am drawing on the sources, on the work of so many actual scholars and historians, and I just want to shout out to all of you because I have gotten an education in the past, let's say, 7 years of my life as a journalist by going back and reading the work of historians that I was never actually taught in school. And that work has, permitted me to make probably careless connections since I'm not a historian, but to draw these through lines and see patterns in in the history of a country that I just was never taught existed. And so those Lowell Mill girls are part of that, as are in New York City in the early 20th century in 1909. It's a young immigrant woman, Clara Lemlich, who gets up and calls for the uprising of 20,000 shirtwaist workers, the massive strike of women garment workers, shirtwaist makers, and she's the one who calls for it. She gets on stage and says, let's have a walkout, and they do, and they win better contracts with almost every shirtwaist manufacturer in the city, except for a couple. And one of the ones that they don't win with is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which burns 2 years later and kills 146 people, the majority of them women. And then in the aftermath of that fire is witnessed by a couple of really key women. One of them, the left organizer, Rose Schneiderman, who at a memorial for the dead 2 days later, I really urge you to go and read her speech from 1911. She gave it at the Metropolitan Opera House, and it is one of the most furious pieces of political thought that you will ever read. And she says, I find no support from you people in this audience. Girls are burned alive in this city every day. She dedicates a good portion of the rest of her life to remaking the labor laws and creating, along with Frances Perkins, who is also a witness to the fire, who also sort of changes the course of her career and works along with Rose Schneiderman on drawing up some of the workplace safety regulations that are in place today. So again, part of my argument is not only has this anger been there and we're not taught about it, it has also been consequential. Yep. It is, our points of egress, in public buildings, are the fire codes and things. I mean, these things didn't just happen because powerful people who were exploiting workers decided that they should probably put points of egress, right? They happened in part because people were furious, and a striking number of those people were women who've never been recognized for their fury and never had it hailed as fundamentally transformative and patriotic.
I mean, you make the really forceful point that, one, obviously, like, women's anger is not new, and then centering this moment that we're living in post, 2016 election still feels like a fever dream. I don't like to think about it too much. But just this idea that you really you say you wanted to capture the rebellion before it's smoothed over and before it's completely flattened. Can you explain a little bit more what you mean by that?
Yes, I was going to originally write this book over a period of 3 years, sort of examining whatever kinds of role that women's anger might play during a Donald Trump administration. And I thought, when I got the contract to write the book, it was going to be one that I did sort of on the side while I did my journalism job full time. Maybe we would publish it in 2020. And I came up with the idea for the book and wrote the proposal before the Women's March, before the airport protests, in which the majority of the protesters and the lawyers were women, before women started running for office in historic numbers, before it was some female high school students who were among the most vocal and the most furious in the wake of the Parkland shooting, and then before Me Too, and then also before the teacher strikes and the immigration protests, and of course before the Kavanaugh hearings. About the time of Me Too, I was like, this is moving insistent, fast, and furious. And this is not a book that I need to write over a period of years. I actually have to try and describe what this feels like, because to me, a lot of it wasn't just Me Too, it was a succession of things. And I couldn't believe the insistence that, like, the anger would be quelled and then it would come back again in another form. It was like an endlessly renewable resource. And it was coming from people who had been, frankly, in many cases, somnambulant for a long time prior to this. I mean, that's one of the things we should talk about, is people who had not been civically engaged, who had been, as far as we could tell, pretty politically apathetic. And suddenly anger was erupting out of them like flame, and they were behaving in ways they'd never behaved before. And I did want to capture it because I am all too aware of the forces that we refer to as backlash, but they're really like the forces of, this is the world we live in, that wants to make us look away from disruptive anger and dissent and from protest, that wants to minimize it, tell us it's not really It's not really a big deal. I watched that happen after the Women's March, which was the single biggest one-day political protest in this country's history. And I write in the book about I went back and looked at the news coverage of that march. Again, the single biggest one-day political protest in this nation's history. And I went back and I looked at the way that protest was covered, both in advance and then after, by the mainstream political press, and it was laughed at. What are these women going to do? On the Sunday shows the next day, George Stephanopoulos didn't even ask a question about the Women's March. He had Kellyanne Conway on for like a 20-minute interview. He didn't even ask her. She brought it up several times before she finally drew a question. And when Chuck Schumer was his next guest, and Chuck Schumer opened by saying, I went to the Women's March in New York, the only question he asked him about it was, were you comfortable with everything you saw there? Right? Like that was the key question, was whether the Women's March made Chuck Schumer comfortable. What the fuck? So, okay, and I go into this in some detail in the book, but it's not an accident. It's not an accident. This is what we do, and they're all from all kinds of political directions, actually, telling us that this is not real, it's not going to be consequential, and it's just performative. It's just silly suburban women, and or that it's a witch hunt and it's doing great damage to great men and great institutions, right? No, that's a real, that is, that's Donald Trump today said, like, men should be scared, right? He said that in a press conference while doing this gesture. I just watched the video. He was like, men should be scared. I'm not making it up. Please watch tonight. Go find that video. I was just like, dude, you're giving it all away. But I know how these things work. And to be honest, they work in our own heads, because moments of actual unrest, first of all, a lot of this stuff is uncomfortable. A lot of the tenor of this anger, it's not like, yay, right? Like, it's deeply painful. Mm-hmm. It's deeply traumatic. The anger between women and between theoretical allies is deep, intense, valid, and real. Yeah. Right? The anger in the lead up to the Women's March, the anger that has been expressed throughout this period about white supremacy within a women's movement, and the way in which women of color and black women who have often been the leading thinkers, founders, innovators, the intellectual linchpins of these movements have been written out of them in the same way that women have been written out of, all women have been written out of a lot of the mainstream history as we're taught it. Yeah. The resentments about co-optation and appropriation are very real. And also the experience, Me Too, which I was perhaps among the most passionate proponents of, was an excruciatingly horrible, the height of it, that 4-month period last fall, was excruciating. It was painful, it was conflicted, there were fights between people who loved each other, there was deep questioning about, was this good? Are we all going to sort of burn up? Or are we going to, this is very uncomfortable.
I mean, let's go there. This idea that, and you write about this too, about we are always told as women that if we're angry, it's not productive. It'll actually make you feel bad. You know, like, you don't sleep well. You don't, like, if you dwell on it, all of it is terrible. And it turns out that that's not true. We've been living, it's like it's slow simmer rage. I will say I'm the happiest I've ever been. It's crazy every day, but you get to rage a little bit every day. But also just this idea that you can hold, that it turns out that women can hold many feelings at the same time, and anger is one of them. But you write so much about how that anger then gets turned into process. And so many of the women that you talk to, especially I notice in the book, and it's very striking, older women who will often say, I was angry, but now I'm running for office. I was angry, now I'm registering 100,000 people to vote. Right. The anger is always in the past, and now the action is, like something noble comes out of that. Right. I'm wondering if you could speak to that.
We are deeply conditioned to not describe ourselves as angry. And I did, almost every woman, actually, of almost every age, said to me in the course of conversation for this book and interviews I did, like, no, I was so angry, but I'm not anymore. I am not, I was angry, but now I'm living at campaign headquarters, and I've left my family and my job, and I'm not, no, now I've really turned, and then, and you're like, okay, all right, but are you? No, I'm not angry anymore. That's the thing. I've turned it into action. And then 10 minutes in, she's like, and motherfucking that's motherfucking that. And I'm like, okay. And there are a couple people who actually, Amanda Littman, who is a founder of this organization, Run for Something, that recruits young people to run for politics. She was a real guide for me on this, and she's young, she's much younger than I am, and she has written really open-heartedly and been like, my anger is my cup of coffee every morning. My anger is literally why I do everything I do every day. It's how, my anger is my fuel, and so I think it's I think it's about reconceiving of anger. And this is not to say that anger, obviously anger between friends, between loved ones, anger is very much like fuel. Within social and political movements, it is, I believe, a necessary, indispensable propellant, right? I actually think that it's anger at injustice and anger at inequity that is the push-off point for so many of the social and political movements that have transformed this country, I believe, for the better, and some for the worse. It also can burn. It can explode. It is incredibly combustible. And because the very nature of mass social movements require very precarious and delicate connections between allies, because coalition is between masses of people, the kinds of masses that you need to affect change, because that coalition is incredibly delicate, anger within it can explode. Wow. And so we are conditioned. And then, of course, there's just the messaging. Women are told, people with less power are told not to be angry, that their anger disqualifies them, makes them ugly, sound like children, like they're throwing temper tantrums, like they're crazy, hysterics. We're told that not coincidentally. It's because anger is itself a really powerful communicative and connective tool. And a woman who gets publicly angry becomes audible to other women. I think we saw that this week with the video of Ana Maria Archila and Maria Gallagher in the elevator with Jeff Flake, and that was. I believe that whatever happens, and I'm not making any predictions about what is going to happen. I don't know, what we're doing. I don't know exactly whether it's going to work. I don't know where it's taking us. But if it does take us somewhere better, and if we commit to doing the work for really, I'm sorry to say at this point, but I'm also happy to say, because this is how it should be the rest of our lives, then I think we're going to look back at that moment, that couple, as one of the catalytic moments, because it was a connective moment, and people saw the power of unapologetic rage, the willingness of women to stick their fingers in the face of a powerful man and demand that he look at them with respect. You look me in the eye. That moment was really, I think, historically crucial in ways that doesn't mean, by the way, that Brett Kavanaugh is not getting confirmed to the Supreme Court. He probably is. It doesn't mean even that, Democrats are going to have a big win in the midterms. I don't know. So it's not this kind of quick take well, that's going to do it. Yeah. It is what it means in the long term to have masses of women begin to hear each other and each other's stories and hear each other's rage. And then begin to recognize it in themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you brought up the Kavanaugh hearings, because it was a very instructive moment on who gets to be mad. Everybody lost their shit except for the woman who is actually hurting and is, has claimed to be assaulted, and we believe her. And we also saw her say over and over again that she wanted to be collegial. We saw her soften, moments, and there was something about that was so, that so many of us identified with, and and then hours later to literally watch a blustering man lie his way through a job interview. He was
literally livid about his love for beer.
Agreed. I like beer. Do you like beer?
I love beer. I love beer. I like beer, Amina.
Listen, talk to Squee and judge about it. If I never have to hear the name Squee ever again, I will be the happiest person in America.
This is one of my victories over the past week has been not actually looking up Squee. I've been like,
You're like, what? But you know, the thing about, the other thing that is instructive in this moment is watching a lot of, like men who do reporting, particularly on the left, have these, what does Oprah call them? Aha moments. And, when they're like, oh, like, you're furious? Are you angry? Like, what's going on here? And really, the idea is that this is a new thing, which if you're a man who's been reporting and you think that 2018 is the first time a woman that you know is angry, I have a lot of concerns. But do you think that we're actually getting somewhere? Because my hope is that because the rage is so loud that it will stick. But we have seen this happen historically. Me Too just happened. Anita Hill was literally 30 years ago. You can't tell me that this is a new feeling.
so I have one optimistic and one pessimistic answer to that question.
Great.
Okay, I'm gonna start with the sort of grimmer observation. So, 2 years ago this week, the Access Hollywood tape was released to the public, and in the wake of it, it's like we've forgotten this. We'd already forgotten it a year later, right? There was a massive outpouring, millions of women suddenly started talking via a hashtag on Twitter and on social media about the times that they had been groped against their will, harassed, assaulted, and it was this massive, it felt earth-shaking. I remember I had friends and colleagues who were telling stories on social media about how they finally turned around on their street harassers and were like, you can't do that anymore, this world is changing. And there was this sense that there was this mass revelation, and I had so many conversations with men in that period of 2 weeks, 3 weeks before the election, where men were saying to me, I spoke to a senator who said to me, I just had no idea. My wife told me that she's been harassed or that she's been groped on a subway. I'm like, dude, literally everyone's been groped on a subway. How is it possible that you did not know this? But that level of revelation, right? Like, I didn't know, I'm hearing this. And it was so many men in my life who were like, my eyes are opened, I didn't know this was a daily part of your existence. And I felt like this is a really important moment. 1 year later, there is a story about Harvey Weinstein, and suddenly there is this again. I mean, and it was staggering. It was, what happened last fall was staggering. And all of a sudden, all these men are saying, I had no idea.
The same men, to be clear.
The same men. And let me just say that 1 year later, as we're having a conversation, I have once again heard from men, I just didn't know how prevalent this was. And I'm like, Mr. Short-Term Memory, what is wrong with you people? This is not like a trend story. This is lived reality, right? So, I do think that there is a desire to move away from things that make us uncomfortable and make us sad and make us upset and disturb our vision of how the world is, and that our brains do that, and we forget. So that's the pessimistic answer to your question about, is this doing something? The more optimistic view is that so much political change and so many of the beginnings of social and political movements come from the act of exposure, right? So I write in the book about Mamie Till, whose son Emmett was 14 and lived in Chicago and traveled to the South and was accused falsely by a white woman of making a pass at him, and he was brutally beaten, murdered, and left in a river in 1955. And his mother, Mamie, a young mother in Chicago, she was told that he was going to be buried there and he wasn't going to come, his body wasn't going to be sent back. She insisted that it be sent back. When it got back to Chicago, the coroner said he couldn't open the coffin. She said, get me a hammer, I will open it myself. She opened the coffin, she saw his brutally mutilated body, and she said, I'm going to have an open casket funeral. And tens of thousands of people saw Emmett Till's horribly beaten body in that open casket funeral, and she said, I'm going to publish the pictures of it in Jet magazine. And that was 1955. It was a decade in advance of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. It was, along with Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat on the bus, one of the sparks, the catalytic moments that kicked off the civil rights movement. And it was catalytic because it forced people who didn't want to think about what lynching was, what it did to bodies and children, what the actual thing was. It forced them to see it and to look at it. And that helped to start to change things. Again, over the course of a decade, and of course then the work is like a fraction done, right? There are a lot, of course, many other examples, including in the Black Lives Matter movement, which in part has been powered by streaming videos of men and women being murdered. Philando Castile dying in a car, which people saw because it was live streamed. The photo of Geraldine Santoro in 1973, who is a woman who died of an illegal abortion. It was published in Ms. Magazine. And I keep thinking about how that active exposure, forcing people to look at the things they usually want to look away from and not think about, and not understand how they're implicated in part because they mostly want to look away from them. Yeah. The active exposure is politically monumental when you're talking about addressing inequality. And I have to believe that this process that we're doing, a little like Groundhog Day every fucking fall, is a version of that. We are forcing people to hear stories that A, we rarely tell, and that they apparently have never been forced to listen to before or take seriously. And I hope that that is, and that, again, I'm acutely aware, these moments, people ask all the time, is this a movement or a moment? And it's like, movements are made up of moments strung out over decades, centuries. This is long. So I hope that what we're doing right now will, in retrospect, appear to be as catalytic as I think it might be.
Earlier you mentioned also, the anger that women can feel towards each other. Mm-hmm. And so it's like 53% of white women voted for Trump, which is actually better than the 56% of women who voted for Romney. So we're getting somewhere.
We did 3 points better.
We're getting somewhere. But I think a lot about how white women are able to dial down or dial up their anger and their outrage depending on are we really doing phones here? Come on. How they're able to dial up and dial down a lot of outrage, and how there are so many more power incentives to not be tapped into the rage mm-hmm. that especially women of color feel and have been talking about for a long time. And so I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, well, you said there are incentives, right, mm-hmm. for white women to not show their anger, not express their anger. And that, Brittany Cooper, who teaches at Rutgers and wrote a book called Eloquent Rage that is my touchstone, one of our shared touchstones, I think. Brittany Cooper has, her work has really helped me think about the nexus, what happens within a white patriarchy, and the way that power is extended in a couple of directions, right? So in a white patriarchy, patriarchal power is extended to men across races, right? And there's like a buy-in, right? You have some proximal participatory power. Even if you're oppressed mm-hmm. fundamentally by white patriarchy, if you're a man, you can also enjoy many of the benefits of patriarchy. The other nexus is whiteness and white supremacy. And white women benefit from, enjoy proximal power thanks to, and are incentivized to defend and participate in white supremacy. And meanwhile, Black women are not really offered either nexus and are simultaneously oppressed by white supremacy and by patriarchy. But they're not offered the proximal power to either one of those, which Brittany Cooper argues is part of why they have always been the leading thinkers in progressive and disruptive and revolutionary movements in this country, because they've never been sort of lured into, there's never been an incentive to not.
Right, the scam doesn't work
The
on us.
scam doesn't work on that.
100%.
Here's who the scam super works on. White women. And this is one of the deep questions that I'm asking in this book that I think a lot of Americans and activists and progressive activists are asking right now. 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump. There has always been on offer a number of rewards to white women who are willing to do the work of defending, supporting, and bolstering white capitalist patriarchal power in this country. It's just, that's on the table for white women. And the question, and right now we're living in a moment, or simply whether or not they're actually like the Phyllis Schlaflys out there, or the white women who are on the front lines of the segregation battle, or the white women, and by the front lines of the segregation battle, I mean the white women shouting at black children integrating schools, go home, right? Or the white women making often false allegations of sexual impropriety against black men in a Jim Crow South and elsewhere all across the nation, accusations that were used as cover for and an excuse for racial violence done on black people. It's not just those women who are the active foot soldiers. It's also the women who are told, white women who are told within a white patriarchy that they will be valued more aesthetically, romantically, professionally, sexually, if they don't show anger. And it's a different dynamic because white women have so much more proximal power, because they're so much closer to white men. I think that the idea that they might turn on those white men is, by some degree, more of a threat, because they have more access to power, money, media, politics. And so the suppression of their anger is really incentivized. And this is the whole trope of the cool girl, right? What's the thing about the cool girl? She never gets angry. She behaves in a way that is, traditionally pleasing to a man and never objects, never is querulous, never dissents. Like, that's the whole thing about being a cool girl. So there's a whole category that suggests to white women in particular that if they are disruptive, they're going to get written out of a lot of the benefits and privileges that they enjoy via their association with white men. We're in a moment in which white women have become angry in really like serious ways, right? It's not just pussy hats, okay? There's it's white women who are doing a lot of the organizing, a lot of the protesting, the daily calls to Congress that helped apply enough pressure that...
You share the story also of like a lot of white women doing the volunteering and that, like really standing behind and letting women of color lead for organizations that are doing the work right now.
Right. There is, and it's hard, I don't want to make any predictions about this, right? I'm acutely aware of the fact that this is a demographic of which I am a member, right? And I don't want to, I'm balancing wanting white women, or enough of a percentage of them, to become civically educated, engaged, and angry in a way that's going to make this country better, that they could theoretically really help, right? Without taking over, appropriating, and erasing the women of color who've been doing the work all along, right? There's a delicate balance there. And I do feel some optimism that this could be a moment in which there is that kind of participation and also education about the power imbalances within the coalition that may or may not be forming and may be precarious. I also respect, there's a woman I quote in my book who worked on the Hillary Clinton campaign, Jess Morales, who talks about having, during the campaign, knowing that white women were at stake, And she talks with frustration about, like, we were taking a gamble that they were either going to be on our side or Phyllis Schlafly's side. And you know what? They always, always, always choose Phyllis Schlafly. And why couldn't we learn this? So I have some respect for the people who are pessimistic on this front and are like, we're never going to change him. I mean, I saw the polling today on Kavanaugh. It's like slightly better than your worst fears.
I mean, not really.
But it's not much.
It's not much.
Not much. And this is a real question. It's a real strategic question. And for my part, I don't have the answer to that question, what's going to work, but I do feel some responsibility to write about race within a women's movement. And by writing about race, in part, it means writing about whiteness. And how problematic it is. And I am invested in trying to reach and address and describe, and I hope welcome in women, white women who are activated, angry, and civically engaged in a way they haven't been, and to help situate them within a history that I myself am still learning about.
I have the easiest job tonight. I feel like I need to take that in. You know, I really appreciate you talking about that, because in the book you write so much about the fighting that happened in the women's movement in the 60s and in the 70s, and how, so much of that was history that I didn't know. You know, I didn't realize that Maxine Waters was literally at everything. That's why she's the best today. Literally, she was at everything.
And everything we're talking about right here, about rage and its political consequence, Maxine Waters has been saying for 40 years. Maxine Waters is like on this.
Right, and you write also about Shirley Chisholm, who is somebody who was a deep inspiration to so many of us here. And the scene that you share in the book about how she would cry because she was so mad. One thing that reading you has really done for me is, I have historically always seen tears as this very, it is a point of weakness. And I think that a lot of women really internalize that. And reading about these powerful women who are sheroes crying and still doing the work was deeply inspirational to me. But also, hearing from so many of the women in the book that it is truly okay to cry, and that actually it is an expression of rage as opposed to an expression of weakness, was something that for me was deeply transformative. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
I think that tears, I've been kind of obsessed with this for a while, because I think tears are so profoundly misunderstood when they come from women. And I do think it's symptomatic of there being no sort of sanctioned way for us to scream and yell when we're really angry, whether that's at work or in politics or in our personal lives. It's just ingrained in all of us that if we actually scream at the volume that we might be tempted to scream, that we are going to look like crazy people, and that we're going to be told that we're just being emotional, we need to calm down. And a way to express dissatisfaction that does not come with that kind of baggage of loud anger is crying. And I'm sure many people in this room, often when I cry, it is out of totally blind rage. But those tears are often wholly misread by whoever you're crying in front of, as a sign of just pure sadness, vulnerability, weakness. There is, again, this goes back to race too, especially for white women who within a white patriarchy are more identifiable as fragile and traditionally feminine and worthy of sympathy or empathy. Tears are understood as and have often been used as a way to manipulate sympathy and protection from the very people you might be angry at. And I talked to a lot of people. It's Barbara Lee, who is my favorite politician. She's a congresswoman from California, and she's the one who recalled to me, she came into politics as a young student thanks to the Shirley Chisholm campaign in 1972, and started working for Chisholm and went with her as a delegate to the convention in Miami, later worked for Ron Dellums, and then eventually, after Dellums retired, ran for his seat and she's been in Congress ever since. And she recalled the way that Shirley Chisholm used to cry. And Gloria Steinem, too, talked to me about the kind of her realization. She came to a realization as an adult that women cry when they're angry. And she described to me an executive who, and I love this story, an executive who once told, she's like, an executive once told me that she does something that I find really useful, which is that when she's angry and she's crying, she says, "You think I'm crying because I'm sad, but I'm actually really angry." And then she just makes it clear while she's weeping that this is about rage, not vulnerability. And Gloria Steinem really admired that approach. But I do think there are all these ways. One of the things I write about in the book is all the ways, given that just like burning raw rage has been so profoundly discouraged and censured coming from women, there are all these other outlets and ways that it has come out, and tears are probably chief among them. Comedy, the anger that undergirds so much of women's comedy, the sort of sublimation into like maternal roles, or saying, you know, God is making me angry. I'm not angry. God is making me angry. I have, and there are incredible examples of that actually throughout history. God actually told Carrie Nation to go and smash all the bars in Kansas, by the way. He like literally came to her in the middle of the day and was like, go take rocks and smash all the alcohol in Kansas. That was 100% God's directive. And so I think that tears, profanity also, I write about the use of profanity, which it turns out, this is maybe my favorite fact that I learned while writing this book, that profanity can serve as an analgesic. And they've done studies where people stick their hands into ice water, and the people who are cursing as their hands are in the ice water can keep their hands submerged for like twice the amount of time that people who are just saying neutral words can.
My last question to you really is about the privilege that you and I have, which you write about this and you are really careful about talking about it all the time. Like we get paid to rage,
yes,
and we get paid to be angry, and it is amazing. And it's not something that we can, we can't recommend to every woman in the room, even today. And so I'm wondering, like, if you could speak a little bit more about that, and the responsibility that we have, and also the truth that this is not acceptable and accessible to everyone.
Yeah. You said earlier the thing about how you feel healthy, like this, you're in a period where you're expressing rage openly, you feel healthy. And I do write in the book about the kinds of messages that I think we're all given about how anger itself is bad for us, right? I think all of us, we would say, many people in this room, like, well, I don't want to carry around so much anger, right? Like, it makes us grind our teeth, high blood pressure, like, I sleep like this, which I totally do. And I had this crazy experience while writing this book. I wrote it very quickly. I wound up writing it in 4 months, where I realized after the 4 months of writing it that I'd been in this kind of like anger biodome, right? I not only been permitted, but encouraged. I was profiting from, I was literally being paid to take women's anger seriously, to think about what it means, to offer it respect and put it in historic context and imagine what it could mean politically. And I felt fucking great. I was sleeping well. I wanted to exercise. My husband's here. He's going to kill me. We were having great sex. Like, he's total prude, by the way. Like, I'm so sorry. It was a period of tremendously good physical health. And that's not to say, like, I was under a very tight deadline. I was enormously stressed out. The nation was falling apart. People's lives are being ruined. This sounds terrible, but like just the physical, and I was horrified by all of that. And yet, the ability to express my rage, there weren't even reviews to come and tell me that it wasn't done well, right? It was like a pure test tube experiment where other people were they were taking me seriously. It was being affirmed and like, well, this is serious writing on this subject. And I had these great health results. But I say this in the book because it made me think, well, maybe it's not the anger that's making us grind our teeth and raising our blood pressure and making us like this in the night. Maybe it's the act of not being able, like having no outlet for it and being told all the time that it invalidates us. And the act of swallowing it, holding it in, finding other ways to like get it out, that's what's making us so sick. But when I do this, and it's been cited in a couple of reviews as if like, you know, it is some kind of self-help regime, and I've tried to make really clear in the book, I am not telling other people to go out and just rage. This was an extraordinary, like, because there are costs for this. What I'm trying, like, I had this crazy experiment where it turned out that, like, it was really good for me in this controlled environment where I was 100% safe and getting money, right? But raging at your boss for even a totally legitimate reason, can get you fired or not promoted or earn you a reputation as difficult or crazy that's going to do damage to you economically. The raging, if you're a person of color, a woman of color who is pulled over for no reason and you are legitimately furious, if you voice that fury, that puts you at risk. So I would never say we all have to go out and be angry, right? Like, what we have to acknowledge is that we live in a world that doesn't make room for our anger and that punishes us for expressing it. And that's the part we have to change. We don't have to change our individual behavior. There's already too much pressure on us saying, you're doing it wrong, you're not doing it right. Like, my recommendation would never be like, okay, now all of you change the way that you're expressing anger again. You've spent your entire lives figuring out how to modulate it. We're going to go. No, we have to change the way it's received. We have to help alter the system that punishes us for it. And that means listening to other women's anger differently. It means being curious about it, even if some of that anger is directed at us. It means taking it seriously. It means listening to the systems around us that discount and diminish it, and recognizing that they're part of a power system. They're there specifically to diminish it because because there's fear for what it could produce politically. It means altering the way we understand the validity and potential of women's fury, especially in political contexts. And that's the kind of lesson that came to me.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We are going to take a couple of questions. There's a microphone down the aisle. I will be clear, we're definitely taking questions, not comments. Not everybody will get to say their piece, but if you want to come down and line up, we will take a couple of your questions. Thank you.
There, you are wearing a tremendous piece of clothing.
This dress is amazing. It has every icon on it. You need to know. It's great.
I'll send you one. And you.
Thank you.
My question is, I'm from Connecticut, the town next to Newtown. You want to talk about rage, right? I knew 4 families in that school. We felt so acutely that was going to be another catalytic moment that was going to change all the laws, all the systems, all the money, and break down the NRA, and it dissipated. Now, we've got pockets of mostly women still working on legislation and lobbying and all, but it's not happening. So, to your point, we've got this immeasurable sadness coupled with rage that's now, 6 years ago? And now there's all this other rage piled up on top that's, you can't fathom what to be angry with when you wake up in the morning. But that's foundational, right? So how do we take that? and I'm not asking you to solve this, but that was a moment that we really thought was going to change the world in which we live. So how do we make sure that doesn't dissipate with all of this bullshit, to use your word, that keeps getting piled on every day? That's still consequential stuff, right? And that's a big one. I'm not asking you to solve it, but I know you've thought about it.
I have
And
thought about it.
thank you.
Oh, thank you. I have thought about it. I've thought about it a lot. One of the, I do write in this book particularly about the movement that came out of the Parkland shooting. And I don't think that what happened in Newtown, I know that there was a belief that it was going to be the explosive thing that changed everything, and I know that it wasn't. And in fact, that in the years after Newtown, gun laws only got looser in this country, which is one of those shocking things that is just true about America. Except in Connecticut. But I don't think that rage just went away. I think that vast portions of America were marked by horror and rage after that. I know that I was. And yes, there is one of the horrifying and true things about these fights is that when they're fights against abusive power structures, those abusive power structures have a tremendously tight grip on the power that they abuse. And that is why these fights take years, decades, centuries, right? And I'm going to come back to the gun question in a second, but to go back to something that I really reckoned with while writing this book, the fight for suffrage in this country, the fight for full enfranchisement, from the sort of 1830s when suffragists first began meeting at abolition meetings, first to the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. That is a 90-year movement. And then another 45 years till the Voting Rights Act. That is more than a century of a fight for full enfranchisement. And there were many activists who spent their entire lives, right? Susan B. Anthony died more than a decade before the passage of the 19th Amendment, and more than 60 years before the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And these things often extend beyond our lifetimes. And I think in part that what happened after Parkland, I don't think it's just an accumulation of rage. I think it's a connection and continuation of rage. And I think that the kind of activism we saw in the wake of the Parkland shooting existed and was expressed in part because of what happened in Newtown. And the Parkland protest, the March for Our Lives, also, I write about this in the book, that was an extension of all other kinds of anger, so that there was a dress of racism. That was a kind of, that youthful movement, which is still going strong, is one that sees the interconnectedness of these oppressions and is really open about them. So that movement has been really clear about the role that racism and misogyny and economic inequality and environmental racism and all these things are connected and part of one big battle. I think there is a movement that is growing out of that. It's not one that it is daunting. It is daunting. In the book, I compare Emma Gonzalez's speech, we call BS, to the Rose Schneiderman speech after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. It is like impossible. She says, girls are burned alive in this city every week. And how daunting that must have felt. And I don't have it. You say there's no answer. There's not. I don't have one. I don't know how it's going to turn out. But I don't want us, one of the things I want us not to want us to consider is that rage is not wasted. It doesn't go into the ether. It may be suppressed. But that rage bears fruit. Maybe 6 years later, maybe 60 years later. But it's also on us to not let it be fully buried. It's on those of us who are committed to fight in the variety of ways that we can and that we should feel compelled to fight, And there are going to be different fronts and different issues, and there are a lot of things to be angry about, but also to do the work to see how those issues and those fights are interconnected and to commit ourselves to it, even though it's hard and indescribably sad.
I wanted to talk about, it's actually really interesting to hear the conversation from the lens of just in the US. And I've lived in the US, I've gone to college in the US, but I can't believe I'm going to say that growing up in a crazy, loud, constantly angry women Middle Eastern family, I am super excited for that now. But my actual question is directly at the word that I think if I look at it from the perspective of, have you looked at women's anger in terms of the way you channel it? Because it seems to be in the US that channeling anger invokes this concept of confrontation, which is a very masculine, in the way we're socialized here, masculine quality. So if a woman confronts someone, it's not something women do. Mm-hmm. Whereas where I sort of grew up, there were different channels of channeling your anger. Like my mother's channeling of anger towards my dad for giving us, I'm one of 5, for giving us lots of sugar when she was out, was not to confront him, but to say that her sister, my aunt, had a problem and leave us with my dad overnight for him. So it wasn't confrontation. So I grew up with I'm comfortable with anger, but I'm wondering, have you thought about women's anger and in the US and being synonymous with channeling it always through confrontation or action?
So I have two quick responses to that. The first is that there's a book that's been published 3 weeks ago, a wonderful book by Soraya Chemaly called Rage Becomes Her. And Soraya's book really deals with some of the things you're talking about, the actual sort of psychological and emotional dimensions of expressing anger. It also deals with politics. But I strongly recommend to everybody here that you read Rage Becomes Her. Mine is really looking more at political movements, and that there is an answer from my perspective to your question, but I think that you should read Soraya's book, because I think that gets closer to the way we're conditioned to express anger within our interpersonal relationships, in addition as to being within, political coalitions. The question that you have about the channeling of anger via confrontation, that it's one of the reasons that I mentioned earlier that I see anger as potentially communicative and connective, right? So there is a way that we write it off as confrontational and as divisive, right? And this is something that the person who wrote about this the best and is Audre Lorde in the early 80s in The Uses of Anger, where she talks about how women should voice their anger over racism within the women's movement to each other, because it's fundamentally generative, that we're not going to move forward until there is an airing of anger. But that anger she sees not as destructive of bonds, but as reinforcing of them, as the way to make bonds, the way to move forward. That's always something I've argued about the women's movement in all its iterations, that its cacophony. It's the fact that it contains multitudes, and that, of course, within those multitudes there are inequities and dissent and argument. And the fact that we keep fighting with each other is what permits us to grow and change and get better, we hope, in different iterations. And so I really actually do see anger as potentially very productive within movements. It also, as I said, can explode and can cause division, but I don't think it necessarily has to. I think, again, it can make people audible to each other in a way that provides pathways for working together and for organizing in ways that can fundamentally alter and disrupt power structures.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much for this amazing discussion tonight. My dad is a 58-year-old white guy who grew up on a farm in Texas, and he thinks that Tucker Carlson has some really well-reasoned thoughts, and he loves Fox News. And it drives me absolutely nuts. So as a journalist, do you have thoughts for how the women in this room and kind of the women in our lives can kind of force better news literacy down the throats of our conservative parents whom we love but who we're furious at?
Good luck.
I'm gonna tell you first. it's possible. I'm going to tell you first that it is possible that nothing's going to work, right? And we sort of have to, like, right? Maybe nothing's going to work, and we make our personal decisions about the relationships we have. And I write in the book about how one of the incredibly difficult things about feeling anger and recognizing anger, particularly around gender inequity, means, because women are an oppressed majority, it means reckoning with a population, identifying as an oppressor, a population to whom we are intimately, familially, romantically, emotionally connected. Our dads and our brothers and our sons and our partners and friends. And that makes these particular conversations incredibly hard. I have always been one to recommend, rather than a forcing down the throat, because I think that is actually, it relates to the last question, that the confrontation is often where you find the division and the impossibility, right? And this sounds pie-eyed and like overly naive, and it just, as I said, these things may not work. But the thing I would recommend, if to the degree that you're comfortable doing it, is articulating your thoughts. This is how I feel. This is why I believe what I believe. And the thing I'm going to ask you to do is just hear me and trust that what I'm telling you is true and well thought out. And it may or may not be persuasive to you, but this is who I am. And again, like, this is pie-eyed. Like, I'm not in any of your families, right? And my family, in my immediate family, I don't have this.
So lucky.
I know. And I don't, and everybody's dynamic is different. And some family relationships actually thrive on conflict, and that's how it works. But, so I think it's about making guesses within your own family. But one of the things within relationships where it's comfortable to fully be yourself, that's sort of the thing, to say, describe what makes you angry. Describe what you think is unjust and unfair in the world. And sometimes if you do it as making yourself visible and your beliefs and your ideas visible, that can create less of that automatic thunderclap of confrontation and work more communicatively and connectively. Good luck. Amina, tell her what to do.
Good luck. Oh no, nothing. My dad does not watch Tucker Carlson. We're taking one last question, so make it count.
Thank you so much for this.
No pressure.
Thank you so much for this book. So a lot of the women I know are obviously very mad, but I think we're also very, very sad, especially the last week. And I think a lot of the anger you talk about very eloquently, that it's grounded in sorrow and loss and pain, from the Parkland students to Black Lives Matter to the women who confronted Flake. These are women talking about loss of loved ones or their bodily autonomy. And I wonder, is there a way for us to stay in that place of vulnerability and sadness and still be political, or do we have to be rageful? And are we just copying the boys by being mad about our pain, or like, can we stay vulnerable?
It's a great question. I don't think that there is an inherent conflict between the sorrow and the rage. I think they're often paired. The language, I wish I had it at hand, but the language that Barbara Lee used when she described how Shirley Chisholm used to cry, as the first and for a long time the only African-American woman in the United States Congress, and feeling very alone, and she said she felt her pain, she felt her vulnerability, and she felt her anger. I think these things often go hand in hand. And when I talk about taking rage seriously, it's often twinned with sorrow. I write in the book that sometimes we feel grief over the very same things that make us angry. This past week is obviously an example of this, as is the Newtown shooting, the Parkland shooting, gun violence, police violence, police brutality. These things are Emmett Till, right? In suggesting that Mamie Till was operating out of anger, I mean to take nothing away from the grief that is probably indescribable. I don't think it's about making ourselves invulnerable. I think it's about taking seriously that some of the things that make us sad should also make us angry at the same time. And I don't want to suggest that we should be copying the men. The thing I want to suggest is that we should be considered that our full range of emotional and intellectual expression should be as valued and valid as the full range of male intellectual and emotional expression.
Thank you so much, Rebecca Traister.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for coming. You're a great audience. Thank you for waiting in line.